Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be introducing you to some red blood cell terminologies, and in particular we're going to be focusing on the size and the colour of red blood cells. So in our healthy and mature red blood cells, the size of a red blood cell is about 7 to 8 microns. They're so small that they can squeeze through our smallest blood vessels in the body, one cell at a time. And what we call normal-sized red blood cells is normocytic. Now, in terms of the colour of red blood cells, they should be nice and red, which represents the hemoglobin content within them. And they have this central pallor in the middle, which is this pale centre representing that biconcave shape of a red blood cell. And that central pallor should make up about 1/3 of the entirety of the whole cell. So what we call these healthy normal red blood cells with normal colour content is normochromic. So how can we actually tell that a red blood cell is healthy? Well, we can take someone's blood and take a look at their peripheral blood smear and have a look at the size and the colour of these red blood cells. So the size should be approximately the same as a lymphocyte or slightly smaller, and the colour, it should be nice and red with that central pallor making up 1/3 of the whole cell. And what we call this, if we use our terminologies, we call these red blood cells normocytic, normochromic red blood cells. Now, there are certain building blocks that we need to be able to form these healthy normal red blood cells. So if there are any deficiencies in the body, that can lead to changes in the size and the colour of our red blood cells. So for example, in some pathologies, that can lead to different sized red blood cells. So if we have a smaller red blood cell in the body, we call those microcytic cells. And this can be commonly occurring in someone that might have iron deficiency anemia. We know that red blood cells are made up of hemoglobin, which needs iron and proteins. So if they're iron deficient, they don't have enough iron, the bone marrow is going to compensate and produce smaller red blood cells. On the other hand, if red blood cells are much bigger than that normal size, we call these macrocytic red blood cells. And this could have something to do with B12 deficiencies, which is really important in that cell development and DNA synthesis, which can impair cell division and cause these larger red blood cells. So in terms of the colour then of red blood cells, if we have a red blood cell that's really pale, it's going to have a much larger central pallor than what our normal red blood cell has. So it's going to have more than 1/3 of that red blood cell having that central pallor. So a really pale red blood cell, we call that hypochromic. And again, on the other hand, if we have a red blood cell that is so rich and red in content, but no central pallor, hardly at all, we call that hyperchromic. And so that's typically got to do with the hemoglobin concentration within these cells. Now, you will learn further on down the track more about specific pathologies that we can start to use these terminologies to actually describe what's happening to the red blood cells in the body. And they're not just visual either. We can actually measure some of these different parameters here. So if we do a full blood test, we can get certain measures of our red blood cells that can tell us about the size and the colour of the red blood cells in the body. So one of those specific parameters is called the MCV, or the mean corpuscular volume. And that's going to tell us the average volume of our red blood cells. Now you might hear mean cell volume or mean corpuscular volume, essentially meaning the same thing. But the MCV is going to tell us about the average volume of the cell or the size. So if we have a normal MCV value, we're going to call that normocytic. If we have a low MCV value, we can say that the red blood cells might be microcytic. And if we have high MCV values, it can tell us the cells might be macrocytic. Another parameter that we have is also the mean cell hemoglobin. So that's going to tell us the average concentration of hemoglobin in our red blood cells. And that's got to do with over here in terms of the color inside of the cells. So if the MCH is normal, we call those cells normochromic. If the MCH is lower than those normal values, we can call those cells hypochromic. And if the MCH is higher, those cells can be called hyperchromic. So when we start to look at full blood tests and start to look at the red blood cell indices or different parameters that these tests can tell us, we can start to then look further into potential pathologies that someone might have in their blood, and that will help with diagnostics and then also looking for different treatment strategies as well. So you'll learn more about that in year 2 when we talk about the pathologies, but for now we're going to focus on full blood counts, and you'll be able to start to see what's happening in terms of our red blood cells and their size and their color, and start to apply some of these terminologies when we look through those in the lab.